I would like to share with you a set of urgent, fragmentary, and finished reflections on what was, as I understood it, the topic of our conversation, our global present. A core issue almost every single speaker addressed in one way or the other yesterday and today was, I would say, that of the durability of our planet. Underlying most of what I heard yesterday and today was, it seems to me, a political, aesthetic, artistic, and almost existential preoccupation with the question of how to inhabit a planet that is in such a dire need of repair, which was the point especially Kader and Suleiman were dealing with this morning, which was the point Dipesh was raising yesterday with his reflections on the question of mutuality, which is also a huge part of what we heard from Anne Stoller and many others. So how to inhabit it, how to share it amongst all its inhabitants, humans and non-humans, and how to remember it in the sense of putting back together its many different parts, and the ethics of mutuality Dipesh spoke about, and in the sense of recollecting it and restituting it to itself and to its inhabitants. So, as we're about to close this event, I want to propose that we refocus our attention on three mega processes that have an almost overwhelming bearing on these questions of inhabitation and durability and circulation and bodies and so forth and so on. All of which I think will be at the center of any debate on the future of the arts and the future of life in this century. Because, of course, the future of the arts, of which we didn't speak as much as I would have expected, is intrinsically linked to that other question which has to do with the future of life. And I suggest that this will be one of the core issues of this century. So the first mega process I would like to invoke is the unprecedented consolidation of power, political power, financial power, technological power, and knowledge power. The unprecedented consolidation of power in the hands of private corporate entities. Private corporate entities whose sphere of action is the globe, at least in the sense Dipesh and to some extent Joe Masco were invoking it yesterday. Corporate entities whose key aspiration is to secede from everybody else, while exercising surveillance on everybody. Entities whose aspiration is to be exempt from taxes, to be free from accountability, in short, to enjoy the kind of immunity and state of exception we used to only recognize to truly sovereign powers. It seems to me that that is something that is going on. It has been spoken about in many different forms by analysts, putting it in this manner as a way of giving it the edge it requires and the urgency it calls for. And this is what, for instance, Shoshana Zuboff, in a very recent book, it just came out, has called surveillance capitalism. Zuboff argues that a global architecture of behavior modification is underway. It is, someone was asking me yesterday, but what are the forces behind it? Zuboff gives us some sense of what those forces are. It is driven by powerful states. It is driven by high-tech corporations. It's driven by military apparatuses. We might even suggest that it's also driven by powerful cultural institutions. I don't want to name them, but you yourself will do that exercise. It threatens what Zuboff calls human nature in the 21st century, just as industrial capitalism disfigured the natural world in the 20th. Anstoller was calling attention yesterday on the question of inequality, which, by the way, has been now erected to the level of a national security issue, that inequality is the new form of terrorism, if you want to put it in a rather callous manner. But it is true that vast wealth is accumulated, especially in what Zuboff calls new behavioral futures markets. Behavioral futures markets are, what is it? These are markets where predictions about our behavior are bought and sold. And the production of goods and services is subordinated to new means of behavioral modification. That's our behavior is the new, of course, in addition to, I speak from Africa, diamonds and all the big wealth we have underneath the soil. In addition to that, we do have now new rare metals, if you want. And this has to do with our behavior, which has become a site of an amazing scramble for the production of new forms of wealth. And early 21st century forms of corporate sovereignty, of course, are made possible in large part by the various legal frameworks behind international trade agreements, behind foreign investment treaties, and other mechanisms for global trade. There are institutions we haven't paid enough attention to. One such institution is the how do you say W? W, okay. So we get mixed into these many different languages and we don't know what in any case, I'm not responsible for what I say in English. Suleiman was talking about translation today. Some of my books are translated in English and other languages, but I'm not responsible for the translation. Translators are responsible for translation. So that institution is called the WTO. We haven't paid enough attention to the kind of work that institution has been doing, the way in which it has rendered possible what I call corporate sovereignty, which once again is characterized by its aspiration to coalesce in one single unit both the power of exception and the power of immunity. So the demos is no longer the sovereign. Finance capital, in the guise of ubiquitous digital architecture, is definitely the new Leviathan. It has become our shared infrastructure. We find it everywhere. There's no part of the world today that is immune to this, that is not part of this architecture, infrastructure. It has become, or it is at risk of becoming, our nervous system, a kind of transcendental mole that nowadays maps out our world, but not only our world, but also what I would call its psycho-physical limits. Indeed, nothing seems to escape its control, whether we're talking about affects or emotions, or feelings, manifestations of desire, dreams or thought. All of life, in short. So capital now extends its grasp deep into the underbelly of the world, and in its wake, it leaves vast fields of debris and toxins, waste heaps of humans ravaged by sores and boils. And now that everything is a potential source of capitalization, it has made a world of itself, a kind of hallucinatory phenomenon of planetary dimensions. So this is something unprecedented. And it will haunt this century. And critical thought and artistic practice will have to reckon with it. In what terms, with what vocabulary, from what archives, is a question we have to address together. So that's the first mega process I wanted to invoke, this historical bifurcation between liberal democracy and finance capitalism and the emergence of corporate sovereignty as a form of sovereignty which seeks to arrogate for itself the law of immunity and the powers of exception. The second mega process I would like to invoke has to do with, Iberia mentioned it in her introduction, technological escalation. Indeed, a key feature of our times is the extent to which all societies nowadays are organized according to the same principle, the computational. Now, what I call the computational is generally understood as a technical system, a system whose function is, as we know, to capture and automatically process data that must be identified, selected, sorted, classified, recombined, codified, and activated. Usually that is how the computational is understood. But we shouldn't forget that it is also a force and energy of a special kind. And I use the two notions of force and energy in the deep Greek sense. It is a force and energy that produces and serializes subjects, objects, phenomena, consciousness, even memory, which can be coded and stored and sold for profit. Now, what is interesting, what is ominous, is that whether operating on bodies, on nerves, on material, on blood, on cellular tissues, the aim is the same. That is, the conversion of all substances into quantities. That, in fact, the quantity becomes the substance, if you want. That we do no longer have that distinction between substances on the one hand, qualities, and on the other, quantities. That the one becomes the other. And we abolish that distinction. So that's the goal. The conversion of organic and vital ends into technical and instrumental means. People like Adorno, even Heidegger, whom Depeche was referring to yesterday, saw this coming. But they saw it coming in the age of the machines. We are no longer in the age of the machine. I mean, the machines are still with us. We are in the post-machinic world. The computational world is, to some extent, a post-machinic thing. Which means that it has opened up to an age when the very concept of the border is put out of the window. The very concept of the limit no longer exists. In the age of the machines, the border limits were still there. They are no longer with us, except, of course, when, as Marx was telling us yesterday, dealing with people you think are useless. You don't want them. You don't want to live with them. You don't want to share anything with them. They would all disappear tomorrow. Our cities will be clean. Would breathe better. So the border is still operating in that kind of logic. But in the digital logic, post-machinic logic I'm referring to, which has become a common universal infrastructure, it has somewhat disappeared, if only in the sense that everything must be subjected to quantification and abstraction, the capture of forces and possibilities, and the annexation by the language of, let's just call it a machine brain, because that's really what the digital is, transformed into an autonomous and automated system. So this is the second key set of comments I wanted to make on this question of technological escalation, going along, of course, with the emergence of corporate sovereignty. These two issues, corporate sovereignty and technological escalation, of course, are connected to two further questions that confront us today and will haunt us for most of this century. On the one hand, the question of life futures, the futures of life, that is, future of the self-organization of being and of matter. That's how usually we define life, at least in certain philosophical traditions. Life futures and the future of reason. And I will say one or two things on this question of the future of reason. But let me say a bit more on the future of life. You know, for a long time, the human race, I mean, I hate the term race, except when it has to do with this only concept, human. When we say human race, I like it. But I don't like race when it's used in any other context. So for a long time, the human race has been concerned with how life emerges, the conditions of its evolution. We have a huge archive on that. The key question today is how life can be reproduced, how it can be sustained, how it can be made durable, preserved, and universally shared, and under what conditions it ends. The question of the conditions under which life ends is, you see it everywhere. In literature, in cinema, in dystopian expressive acts, it's all over the place. I mean, I happen to like every I wasn't colonized. I was born a little after or just before we became independent. So I cannot claim that precious status. But like you know what I mean. We happen to stop by Europe regularly. I live in South Africa. I travel a lot. So once in a while, I happen to stop by Europe, and of course, I go and try to buy some books. I have to keep nurturing my you see. And I go to a very good bookstore, Librairie Compagnia, at the intersection of Boulevard Saint-Michel and la Rue des Écoles. It's a good, very good bookstore. Not like some bookstores I have visited here yesterday quickly. Completely, I mean, it's not much to buy. And over the last year, I have been struck by the number of books coming out having to do with the end of the world. It looks as if Europeans are, I mean, they are happy to, it's like Europe is becoming like a lovely museum. Beautiful museum. History is finished. They don't want anybody to come in. They are just waiting for the end of the world. Countless philosophical treatises on the question of the apocalypse, the infatuation with the end, question of the end. And how is it that we prepare ourselves towards the end? And with it, the rise of new forms of nihilism. You don't believe in anything. There's nothing left to believe in. Nothing left to fight for. In any case, it doesn't matter. And the end will come in a cataclysmic manner. Why wait? Bring it on. Bring it on now. A lot of the cultural sensibility, at least in France, seems to be moving in that direction. And you see it in the intellectual production. And in the world of arts too. I mean, Kader can tell us more about that. So this question is with us, and I'm afraid that it will mark the philosophical temper and the artistic temper of this century. It's a question that is forced upon us by the epoch itself, characterized as it is by the impending ecological catastrophe and by technological escalation. First of all, it is a fact, of course, that unprecedented numbers of human beings are today embedded in increasingly complex technostructures. The latter are increasingly intervening in the dynamics of the Earth system on a planetary scale, that we know. We also know that this has led to the transgression of planetary boundaries, such as those related to anthropogenic climate change. We saw it yesterday. Generative land use change, accelerated biodiversity loss. It was spoken about yesterday too. Perturbation of the global biogeochemical cycles of nitrogen and phosphorus, the creation and release of novel entities such as nanoparticles and genetically engineered organisms in the atmosphere. It's also true that both metabolically, for example, in terms of energy needs, and reproductively, technologies are becoming more and more tied in complex networks of extraction and predation, not only in Africa or Latin America, but also in major places like China, India, and the rest. Take, for instance, what is going on in the domain of genes and molecules, the heyday of DNA study we currently live in, has allowed the cracking and public dissemination of the genetic codes of humans, but also of plants, of animals, and this in turn has given way to an exponential rise of biological patents, as currently nearly, I think, is 20% of the human genome is now privately owned in a context of a market logic that addresses life as a commodity. A commodity to be manipulated, to be replicated under conditions of market volatility, if you want. I could go on and talk about what's going on in terms of the food chain, the extent to which patented GMO, for instance, genes are absorbed into our bodies, talking about bodies yesterday, in a proprietary relationship of biological subjugation, the body itself becoming like an expanded multiple infrastructure where intervention can happen at many different scales. I mean, you can basically change your body today. The body has become so malleable. It has no longer any integrity. I wish Merleau-Ponty would come back now. I wonder what he would tell us about the body. So it is correct then to argue, I mean, it's a term we use a lot. I mean, we South Africans use a lot. It is correct. Because many different things are incorrect. So they like it. It is correct that to argue that there is a shifting distribution of powers between the human and the technological. There is. It is. We are right in the midst of it. That big distribution of power, and we don't have time to go into details, but let me just, I can't resist saying this. This is creating a huge panic in Western traditions of thought. Because these are traditions of thought that are premised on a clear-cut division between the human and the rest. The human and the object, the human and the animal, the human and plants, and all of that. There is a clearly defined boundary between these entities. Even Western-inspired philosophies of emancipation are premised on that. They are premised on the basic foundational idea that a human being is not an object. A human person is not a thing. This division between people and things, wealth in people and wealth in things. There's no way of understanding Marx, I mean, all those who thought about human emancipation, without starting, that is the starting point. And Western philosophies have always been living under the fright that one day the object, technology, which the human has invented, it would take our place. Suddenly we wake up one morning and then, look, the thing we have invented is now inventing us. It governs, it rules over us. A huge panic, just like the panic when it comes to things like civil war. Civil war is something Western political thought cannot withstand. That's the biggest calamity that can happen to a polis. So you see, the West is besieged like that with all kinds of fears, which it has managed to share through all kinds of mechanisms with the rest of the world, making us believe now that, you see, I wake up and then I'm afraid, and in fact, I'm inhabited by someone else's demon. So one part of its power has been its capacity to make us believe that its own demons are ours. So we go on like that, and that's what Fanon calls alienation. It's not something else. So why are we talking about all of this? Talking about all of this because that panic, we see it coming. We see it coming, and it's taking shape. It's no longer that it's just a fantasy. It's not any longer just a matter of fantasy. We have witnessed over the last decades, for instance, the development of algorithmic forms of intelligence. They have been growing in parallel with genetic research, and often in its alliance, and the integration of algorithms and big data analysis in the biological sphere does not only bring with it a greater and greater belief in techno-positivism and modes of statistical thought, it also paves the way for regimes of assessment of the natural world and modes of prediction analysis that treat life itself as a computable object. That's the point I wanted to make, that in relation to this matter of the future of life, if you look into it from within this paradigm, the response is simple. It's a computable object. It's something you compute. And it has no meaning beyond that, or no value beyond that. I could go on and on this. Let's leave it at that. You understand the point. Now, when you say that life is but a computable object, something that is potentially computable and predictable, when you say that, you turn your back to a whole tradition that considered life itself as an open-ended system, as something that was non-linear, something that could be exponentially chaotic. And I'll give you one example if you want to understand life in that sense. It's the work of a Nigerian author called Amos Tutuola, a book called My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, which is a techno-futurist work written in the 60s, coming from Yoruba mythologies. I know some people here who are interested in that. Mythologies in which the distinction between the person and the object, which we talked about, is not the key defining metaphysical belief. It hasn't, because they believe, read that book, Kader is Kader now, and then Kader goes out, and he enters into, he turns into a bird. At some point, he loses a leg. I don't wish it to him. And then he borrows a leg from Omar. He pays a little price, and then life is open-endedness and an encounter with the unexpected. So it's an entirely different. It is, if you want, incomputable. We're talking this morning about irreparability. Here is another concept: incomputability. We live in an epoch when we have to ask those questions. Is there anything left that is incomputable? That shouldn't be computable. As a condition for the durability and the sustainability of the world and all its inhabitants. Is it that to share that world as equitably as possible, we need to decide at some point on what the thresholds of computability are and where it is that they should end. So these will be questions we'll have to deal with as the century unfolds. Now let me try to bring all of this to a conclusion by making some comments on the futures of reason. I want to make those comments because these are also times when many are gradually coming to the realization that reason may well have reached its limits. Of course, I mean, in some other cultures it was always known that reason had limits. You know what I'm trying to say. In any case, it is a time when reason is on trial. Let's just put it like that. Now, as you know, reason is a faculty we use to recognize in humans and in humans alone. That's how we distinguish humans from the rest. In the Western traditions, we have all willingly or not become the inheritors. Reason was always seen as the highest of all human faculties, the one that opened the doors to knowledge, to wisdom, to virtue, and most importantly, to freedom. So I'm trying to suggest the extent to which the fate of reason has become so intrinsically linked to the fate of freedom. That's the point I'm trying to make. So today, reason is on trial in at least two ways. On the one hand, reason is increasingly replaced and subsumed by instrumental rationality when it is not simply reduced to procedural or algorithmic processing of information. I mean, this question of information, that information, how to process information or data, the two sometimes used without any distinction, that everything is data, everything is information. All that you need to do is to process it. Know how to process it. You don't need to think. That we don't need to think any longer. Reason is on trial via that pressure to stop thinking. Please just stop thinking. And everything seems to be coalescing to induce us to stop thinking, or to force us to stop thinking, if indeed that's what we want to do. So, even on trial, reason is under duress in that sense, because what it calls for is for constant interrogation. The Fanonian thing, oh, my body, by which he also means reason, bodily reason, the reason of, always make of me a man who questions, who interrogates. So the call to suspend interrogation is a foundational threat to the very idea of freedom, and by extension of democracy, and it will be ever more so as this century unfolds. Then I mentioned the computational. Believe me or not, the computational reproduction of reason has made it such that reason is no longer, or is a bit more than just the domain of human species. We now share it with other agents. Reality itself is increasingly construed via statistics, metadata, modeling, and mathematics. Can go on and on this. I will stop. Let me now try to conclude. The mega processes I have highlighted leave us with foundational questions which once again will haunt this century. The first is, what remains of the human subject in an age when the instrumentality of reason is carried out by and through information, machines, and technologies of calculation? I think that's an important question. What remains of human subject, or the promise, the concept of the human subject was the expression of, because it was less than a fact, it was a promise. The promise to stand up on our own feet and to legislate on our own behalf without any sovereignty other than the sovereignty we have produced for ourselves. Not corporate sovereignty, not religious sovereignty, but our collective form of sovereignty. What remains of that is an important philosophical, artistic, aesthetic question. The second, who will define the threshold or set the boundary that distinguishes between the calculable and the incalculable? What is it that we will never be able to calculate? Kader and Bashir were talking about restitution this morning. I mentioned it, I think, yesterday. You see, some of the things we lost at the hands of those who came to take them away from us, they will never be restituted. Not only will they never be restituted, even if we wanted them to pay for the reparations, how do you calculate all of that? Some things are incalculable. And for the human, for the world to achieve the level of durability and sustainability we are about to lose, we have to have a set a border between what is calculable and what is incalculable. Because it has no price will ever be able to restitute it. It is priceless, if you want. It's beyond any quantification and any price. So if we lose that sense that there are things that are beyond any price, then we create an entirely different possibility where, of course, some things are worthy, others are not, and because they are not, therefore they are, as Anne was saying, is disposable, dispensable. The third question is whether, in the double-edged conditions of our times, we can turn these instruments of calculation and power into instruments of liberation. In other words, what will it take to turn calculation itself into a real site of political struggle, knowing full well that, more than ever before, modes of seeing and measuring are key devices in current projects of domination at a planetary scale. So let me conclude. It seems to me that reason has found its limits when all we can ask from it is to detect patterns or to recover artifacts whose existence is derived from financial models, themselves built on technologies of miniaturization and automation. Reason can also be said to have found its limits when it becomes so tightly aligned with the politics of national security, the politics of exclusion and enclosing. It looks to me as if we are entering an age when to act without reasoning is the new norm. When to act requires us to leave behind reflective thinking and the slow pace of consciousness, when data correlation is all that matters. We are also fast approaching a time when an epistemic hegemony will have reduced life and the earth to a financial problem, to a problem of financial value. The problem is not to turn our backs on technology. What we must find out is what would a counter-hegemonic use of hegemonic instruments look like. Can we imagine a different political usage and purpose for mass computation? What kinds of counter-institutions, including places like this, or universities, museums and the rest, what kinds of counter-institutions are needed if we are to intervene in the repair of our planet in a significant manner? Will we be able to invent different modes of measuring that might open up the possibility of a different aesthetics, a different politics of inhabiting the earth, of repairing it, and of sharing the planet? I would like to leave you with those questions. Thank you very much.